fellow dark-siding minions of doom and evil. It is I, Prosky von Kronos, here with another entry into the villain competency tier list. Do you say competency or competent? I don't know how you pronounce that word. I'm just gonna go with competency because that's how I've been saying it for the past several videos. Anyway, we're on our next installment of one of my favorite series to do on this channel, and today we're gonna go over another personal favorite of mine. He's from the hit cartoon Avatar: The Last Airbender, one of the greatest cartoons released in all time. I think if you haven't heard of it at this point, you might be living under a rock. And we're going to be going over the main villain from that show, Firelord Ozai. Ozai, again, as with previous villains in this list, we're going to go over Ozai's history and his background just a little bit to understand his personality and estimate where he lands on the competency ranking. Because Ozai is really interesting as a dictator type villain because unlike characters such as Palpatine or Horde Prime or the Prophet of Truth, who kind of like became autocrats and took power for themselves and created unprecedented eras of tyranny under themselves, Ozai actually has a lineage of individuals to trace himself back to. He has Firelord Sozin, his grandfather, and Firelord Azulon, his father, and the numerous Firelords before that, of which he could, we could compare his reign towards and see its prosperity and see how close he was to achieving his goals. This tier list is meant to estimate villains and their closeness to achieving their personal goals. So, comparing Ozai to his predecessors in terms of achieving the goal of overarching prosperity for the Fire Nation will not be the point of this video because clearly throughout the series, especially near the end, we see that Ozai's goal wasn't necessarily the greatness of the Fire Nation, but the greatness of himself, which will factor in heavily to his competency tiering later on in the video. So, excuse me, that out of the way, let's begin. So, to begin with, Ozai is he's definitely power hungry, like all tyrannical villains kind of have to be, right? He was born the second son of Firelord Azulon. His older brother Iroh was actually in line to inherit the throne of the Fire Nation, the warmongering main antagonistic faction of the Avatar: The Last Airbender franchise. They almost conquered the entire world because Firelord Sozin believed that the entire world needed the Fire Nation. Wow, excuse me, guys, sorry. The entire world needed the Fire Nation to ascend into a new era of greatness. And to be fair, I mean, the world was very chaotic at the time. It was fractured between the Earth Kingdom, the Air Nomads, the Water Tribes. So the Fire Nation, and Sozin specifically, he wanted to bring an era of order and security to to the entire planet, basically. And the Avatar at the time, Roku, had, obvious differences with Sozin because, of course, this plan would destroy the balance of the world and just create a whole lot of spiritual and physical suffering for basically everyone involved that wasn't from the Fire Nation. But nevertheless, not Azulon, what am I saying? Sozin persisted and ultimately, indirectly killed Roku by letting him die during a volcanic eruption. Now, say what you will about Sozin, he was a very Hitler type figure. He obviously exiled and punished a lot of, ethnicities within the Fire Nation. He penalized, actually, this is a fun little bit of Avatar trivia. Sozin penalized homosexuality. He most likely during the early parts of his reign penalized earth benders, water benders, air benders within the Fire Nation's borders before embarking on a path of conquest throughout the world, establishing colonies in the Earth Kingdom and beginning a 100-year war that would continue long after he was passed on. But whatever you could say for Sozin, he genuinely had the Fire Nation's interests at heart. It may be a very warped definition of interest. Of course, what he believes is an interest might be very contrast to what the later leaders of the Fire Nation that we see in the Legend of Korra might think, the more liberal-leaning politicians that became Fire Lord, like Zuko's daughter. However, he did genuinely care about the Fire Nation. He thought that if the Fire Nation were to control the world, not only would the Fire Nation, but all its subjects ascend to a new level of greatness, because he thought that firebending was the most superior form of element bending, and the Fire Nation's advances in technology and their supposedly superior culture could be used to enlighten everyone living under them. We don't know much about Azulon, but we can presume that he had these similar viewpoints because of the fact that, simply put, that we don't know enough about him to draw our own conclusions about his personality. So it's pretty fair to estimate that Azulon, being a relatively conservative individual and believing heavily in traditionalist Fire Nation principles, but still having a sensibility of honor and justice, not a high sensibility, but we can definitely see that Azulon was somewhat sympathetic when Iroh lost his son Lu Ten during the siege of Ba Sing Se, and Ozai suggested that, Iroh's birthright be revoked because he no longer had a bloodline to transfer the Fire Lordship to. Azulon flew into a rage and demanded Ozai kill Zuko just to see what it would feel like to lose a child. So obviously, despite having a very twisted, warped sense of justice, Azulon did possess a sense of chivalry, at least within Fire Nation principles and conduct. So, with that in mind, we now move on to Ozai, the subject of this video, and undoubtedly the craziest Fire Lord in the country's history. His reign, ironically, only lasted 5 years, but those 5 years were the most tumultuous in Fire Nation history by far. I mean, this guy is basically if Hitler had superpowers and completely went all in on the whole Vril Hollow Earth bullshit that Himmler was feeding him throughout the war, like the whole esoteric Aryan Nordic master race thing that you could find lizards in the Hollow Earth type thing. Like Ozai was completely on board with esoteric like plans of world domination and spiritual awakening and stuff like that. What I mean by that is his ultimate plan wasn't to just conquer the world conventionally through just superior technology, numbers, and military strategy, but rather use a comet coming from space that would enhance the firebender's abilities to burn down the entire Earth Kingdom. Like I don't think I can tell you how insane that is because by the time that he actually enacts this plan later in the series, the Earth Kingdom is most for the most part conquered. Ba Sing Se was taken thanks to his daughter Azula, and the Dai Li have been fully transferred under Fire Nation control. So at this point, Ozai literally owns the place that he intends to burn to a crisp purely to create a new world. He wants to crown himself Phoenix King of this new glorious empire and become ascendant to something of a god, not dissimilar to what Palpatine ultimately envisioned for his empire, because Palpatine, if you recall, did not want to be settled with a galactic empire ruled through conventional warships and armies, but rather he wanted to create a Sith empire where the dark side itself ruled. So in that way, we can see that Ozai sought a power beyond the political propaganda spewed by his forefathers, but at the same time, it definitely gets into a bit of a rocky road when estimating his competency levels, right? Because his personal goals were to secure dominion over the world and become this messiah figure of a new planet, a new regime that's born from his rampant destruction. But at the same time, he completely ignores the fact that the Earth Kingdom is already under their control, and they would need the Earth Kingdom to have a unified world because the Earth Kingdom is a central faction within the Avatar universe. I mean, it has massive farms, it has a large working population. I think it has the largest population of any of the Avatar countries. So the fact of the matter is, Ozai is slaughtering a completely decent useful workforce for the sole purpose of pursuing his insane vision, which to basically everyone outside a very select innermost circle of loyalists and people buying into his esoteric madness just seems completely insane. Like even people within the Fire Nation, uh, years and decades on after Ozai's reign, are questioning like the mentality of his plan. They're wondering how this plan could have come about. To be fair to Ozai, he is the result of generations of codification of Fire Nation supremacist ideology. I'd say Ozai is the final evolution, unlike a lot of other characters in Avatar that face inner conflict and have trouble conquering their demons and ultimately recognizing themselves for who they truly are, like Zuko, Aang, even Iroh on some extent, etc. Ozai never has any inner turmoil within himself. He knows from day one exactly what he wants, which is more and more until he becomes this sovereign over the entire planet. He wants to be worshipped, not just as a liberator and enlightener of the people, but as a living god. He has the belief that not only are firebenders supreme, but since he is the Fire Lord of Firebenders, he is the most supreme being that has ever supremed. He really likes that brand of shoe, the Supreme brand. Yeah, he really likes that. So Ozai is definitely up there in terms of ego for this list. And I mean, that's saying something because, we've gone over people on this tier list who have egos the size of cities, the size of planets. But when you look at Ozai in the context of Avatar, where his type of leadership is sort of unprecedented, like even Shin the Conqueror, a former Earth Kingdom, like an earthbending warlord that was defeated by a previous Avatar, I think Ozai even eclipsed that person. And when you look at the Legend of Korra villains, I think that in terms of like the level of evil, that they were trying to accomplish, the scale of it, and their intentions. If you factor all that in, because you have Amon, Vatu, who's the third season villain? Zahir and Kuvir. I mean, they were all bad apples in their own way, shape, and form. But aside from Zahir, I mean, not Zahir, Vatu, who was a literal dark god and the overarching antagonist of the whole Avatar mythology, I'd say Ozai is the second most greatest threat in Avatar history, purely because of his insane ideas. And I mean, he's just a guy. He's not a dark god. I mean, though he would likely want to become one very heavily. So how does this factor into his competency level? Well, Ozai is to describe him as competent, it's a sort of a mixed bag, so to speak, because while he was very close to achieving a lot of his personal goals of like this esoteric Fire Nation dominion, he also seemed intent on doing everything possible to alienate as much of not only the entire planet that he was trying to rule over, but his own subjects as much as possible. He exiled Zuko for speaking down the War Council, despite the fact that, to be honest, it would have been much more sensible to just let the general engage in an Agni Kai with Zuko instead of just doing it himself. Because to be honest, even like Iroh said that like Zuko was surprised to see Ozai in that theater because apparently he disrespected the Fire Lord. But honestly, that general's plan was also a bit insane. Not that I doubt that Ozai cared. I mean, Ozai would be completely on board with sacrificing fresh soldiers for the sole purpose of victory in battle. I don't think that was the problem. The problem was that after Zuko spoke up, he decided to take it upon himself to viciously maul Zuko in front of everyone, which I think shook a lot of people's faith in Ozai from the get-go. Like, I mean, because you got to remember, during that Agni Kai, like the entire Fire Nation aristocracy was present, all the military elite, landed gentry, all the noble families. I mean, basically anyone who was anyone in the Fire Nation capital was bearing witness to the leader of their country burning his son alive because he had the audacity to say, we should not sacrifice fresh troops just to win a battle and, let them all die in the process. So I'm sure that shook a lot of people's faith within Ozai. Not that he cared, because again, Ozai's goals are stretching at that point stretched far beyond. I'm sure he was already festering ambitions even back then of like becoming the unmitigated sovereign over the entire planet. Still, though, I mean, there's more sensible way. Like even Palpatine waited until he fully succeeded and the entire galaxy was his to go crazy, evil murder man mode. Horde Prime already ruled over the entire galaxy by the time that he was seen. And plus, Horde Prime's like army were just his progeny, his clones, and also like mindless robots. Ozai had to rule over a kingdom of living sapient people. And yet he seemed intent as possible on as treating them as disposable drones. I mean, even Azula, which is supposedly his favored, child, he just constantly treats with coldness and disrespect, and as it turns Azula psychotic because of that, which kind of backfires in the end because she just becomes a wreck, a miserable wreck at the Fire Nation capital, and she's unable to hold it because her emotions get the best of her, and Katara and Zuko ultimately best her at the Agni Kai. And of course, Ozai himself fails because he had the hubris of challenging the Avatar. That's really Ozai's greatest weakness. A lot of villains' greatest weakness, of course, is hubris, but I think Ozai's is on another level because of the amount of mental conditioning that was put into his head from an early age. Because we could see Ozai did not have a troubled childhood; he was not abused whatsoever. I mean, he seemed from the few hints we get about him growing up, he seemed like a very happy, content child, but he just wanted more power. He was probably he probably grew up feeling very entitled and had a sense of control and want over the entire Fire Nation. And he believed that Iroh, who was a very gentle and kind person, especially in Fire Nation culture, did not deserve the throne and should be his. So when you take all that into account and then factor in Ozai's personal goals, his competency becomes a bit damaged. I believe that really what harms Ozai's competency the most is the way that he kind of forgoes conventional military strategy a lot of the time and rides everything heavily on Sozin's comet. Which in turn, because he has this fleet of airships right at the end, and he like invests all his resources into this whole Phoenix King thing, where he's like, I will declare myself Phoenix King and rule unmitigated over the entire planet forever. And he just kind of forsakes like the Fire Nation's occupation. He just lets it all in the hands of lesser generals, and he just even abandons commanding the entire war effort at home purely to like burn down the Earth Kingdom. Which, by the way, I wonder how that would have worked because I mean, I know Ozai was a particularly gifted firebender, and he was particularly gifted with because of Osozen's comments. So I know that he could have done serious damage, some apocalyptic level damage, but like, how would have that created a new world? Because he said he wanted to build a new world out of the ashes of the old one. But what would there have been left to really build off of? Like, all the farms would be gone, all the people would be crisped and dead. Like, I don't think he was really thinking long term. And so, even though his goals might not have aligned with the Fire Nation's overarching principles at the time, and they became like a sort of deranged evolution, this deranged Hyperborean desire to like control everything, rather than just use conventional tactics and political conservatism and traditionalism to rule over the planet and standard Fire Nation supremacist practices and ideals and cultural values. He instead just goes on this murderous marauder rampage. Even though he does all of that in service of his goal, the fact that his goal was not even achieved because his goal was unattainable because of the method that he was using to employ it. Does that make any sense? Like, even like, because on this list, we estimate villains by how close they were to achieving their personal stated goals. And Ozai's goal, I'm not judging him based on his predecessor's Fire Nation goals, but rather his own personal plans. But the plan he undertook to achieve his, plan was pretty poorly thought out. But are there any positives to give to Ozai? Yes, I'd say there are a few positives to give to him. I mean, despite the fact that his reign was only 5 years, he achieved a lot during those 5 years. I mean, he had Azula take over Bossing Say. I mean, he groomed such a useful asset. I do respect him for that. He groomed such a useful, a useful pawn in the form of Azula, who single-handedly secured Bossing Say and got the Dai Li to defect from their former leader over to her. He did manage to get Zuko back on his side temporarily, and he did earn the respect of the Fire Nation enough to hold his throne, despite the fact that he did burn his son alive publicly in an Agni Kai. And I'm sure the remainder of his reign wasn't exactly very kind either, to even to firebenders. But I think his greatest triumph was actually ascending to the throne itself, because he managed to eke out that deal with Ursa, where she saved her son Zuko's life by presumably assassinating Azulon, and then Ozai would presumably banish her subsequently. When he seized the throne, he kind of pushed Iroh out, and he achieved political dominance that way. And I'd like to say that Ozai has done way more, but the fact, what am I saying? Fact of the matter is, when you look at the overarching venue of Avatar history, his reign, while impactful, was very, very brief. It was arguably the briefest in the country's history. It was 5 years of unmitigated apocalyptic terror on the likes of which had never been seen before. And afterwards, he was just he was robbed of his bending. In the comics, he leads this political fringe group that worships him because he's the embodiment of firebender supremacy. To be honest, I feel like the Ozaists would rather have Azulon or Sozin as their figurehead, but both of them were long dead by the time of the comics, which were, post Avatar. So they just kind of had to settle for Ozai. And they practically knew no one else, because I'm sure Ozai ran a very efficient police state, to his credit. But still, I mean, you have like this paragon of Fire Nation conservative supremacist ideals, and then you have this crazy guy who wanted to destroy everything they'd worked so hard over the Hundred Years' War to achieve, aka subjugating, not destroying, subjugating the Earth Kingdom, their biggest enemies, their biggest rivals by far, and presumably the Water Tribe as well. And just never did that. He just never did that. I can't even say that Ozai was responsible for the destruction of the air nomads, because that wasn't him. That was was it Sozin or Azulon? I have to look that up. I think that was let me check. Who who killed the air nomads in Avatar? File Sozin. Okay, it was Sozin, yeah. So even he wasn't even responsible for that, wiping out the air nomads to, prevent like the birth of the Avatar and the reincarnation cycle into their camp. So overall, even if Ozin had insane goals, and it's not fair to judge him based on the wider Fire Nation principles, but his own personal ideology, he wasn't even close to achieving those goals, because the plan in which he wanted to achieve them was not pragmatic whatsoever, and relied instead on apocalyptic madness and destruction on a scale unprecedented, which would have only caused more harm than good. Still, I mean, he's voiced by Mark Hamill, and he has a pretty cool design, especially his Phoenix King drip. I mean, that shit is awesome. It's peak evil overlord design. Like, bam. just stellar work. Amazing. Like who are his who are the people who are his costume designers because they have to be given a raise. But anyway, that aside, unfortunately for Ozai, since he was never ruled over by any other masters and kind of made a pawn over, I will put him above Bayverse Megatron and Carlton Drake, who are kind of bitched. Carlton Drake bitched by Riot without even realizing it because he was just so manipulated at that point, and Bayverse Megatron, who was basically everyone's bitch throughout the Bayformers movies. I will give Ozai credit that he was never really subservient to anyone else, and at least everything he did was of his own accord, however successful it was or not. Definitely not. So I will put him in the high tier of they're alright, could be better, but still fearsome. Thank you all so much for watching. I will cover more Avatar videos on the villain competency tier list later on throughout this channel. Thank you all so much for the views, likes, and subscribes I've been getting recently. You guys are awesome. And yeah, this is your Dark Lord Kroski Von Kronos with another villain episode tier list complete. And I will be signing off now. Peace, outsiders.